Welcome to Everything About You Matters, a relational clinical social work podcast. My aim with my guests is to discover the myriad ways clinical social workers make sense of the human experience and build toward a more just world one person, family, and community at a time. I'm your host, Lance Peterson, a licensed independent clinical social worker, LICSW, and social work professor, PhD, in the Morrison Family College of Health School of Social Work at the University of St. Thomas. Clinical practice with older adults has been an expanding area of social work practice as the aging population has increased in the United States. Today we talk with someone passionate about serving this population. Beth Turbak Brown is a 2016 graduate of the MSW program. Beth participated in the Area of Emphasis in Aging Scholars Program and remains a council member with the Area of Emphasis in Aging program today. Beth is a grief counselor who has been with Park Nicollet Hospice for nearly 10 years. Beth served as a hospice social work case manager for her first 5 years at Park Nicollet, and then has been one of the grief counselors for the past 5 years, supporting the loved ones of hospice patients through the first 13 months following the death of their loved one. In Beth's role, she conducts one-on-one grief counseling sessions, holds various classes and events on grief and remembrance, assists clients in connecting with community grief resources, and conducts a monthly support group specifically for young partner loss. While grief work is hard, Beth knows that grief evolves and feels honored to walk with individuals on their grief journey. Beth, welcome to the program today. Great to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So kind of a cool little side note here is that I met Beth, I believe, for the first time at a simulation event we were doing for the Area of Emphasis in Aging.
That's right.
So that was serendipitous that I got to meet you during that time.
Absolutely. Well, and thanks for the invite. I really appreciate it. It's
Absolutely. Well, let's start by having you tell us about the context of your practice as a grief counselor with a hospice program.
Absolutely. So hospice is required to provide 13 months of grief counseling support to the loved ones of patients who've died on their program. And loved ones is pretty broad language, and it's meant to be broad. Family, friends, neighbors, whoever feels like they're grieving this loss. Nationwide, this is a hospice insurance benefit, so it's free of charge to my clients. And I would say for most hospital-based hospice programs, what that looks like is what we do. Offers one-to-one support with a counselor, whether from a spiritual care background or a clinical social work background. Offers various groups, again, connecting folks to resources in the community. I feel it's really a part of hospice's mission to offer grief education to the community as well. So we take that as a part of our role as well.
Okay. Now you mentioned this is free to clients.
Yes.
So is it funded through the federal government? Some other?
It's funded through, right. So Medicare, for example, is the largest payer source of hospice, and it's built into that benefit. And then there's additional funding. In my case, for example, the Park Nicollet Foundation also supports our department. So I think this is why what's offered by a hospice can vary a little bit, hospice to hospice. Of course, I'm a bit biased, but I feel like Park Nicollet really does what they need to do to offer kind of robust grief counseling support. So yes, but between the insurance benefit and then supplemented support by, per se, the local hospital, their foundation, et cetera.
Which is a testament to the value that people see in the service.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What modalities do you use in your practice? Now, I know you said you pretty much do one-to-one sessions,
right? That's the bread and butter of what I do is one-to-one grief work. So I'm certainly working from a grief and loss lens. Grief and loss, of course, being the result of a death, but broader than that too, the result of an unknown future, the future that's not expected, the result of a change in family role, change in these systems. observing a loved one's losses of abilities throughout their disease progression, these sorts of things. So certainly operating from a lens of grief and loss. I draw from family systems theory, again, knowing after a loss, this system is going through a huge change, roles are changing, etc. I draw a lot from a strengths-based perspective. What historical coping strategies and coping tools have clients utilized in past experiences? So drawing out of that. And I would say those are predominantly the frameworks I'm drawing from.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense with family systems because, a big part of family systems is this idea of how transitions really change sort of the infrastructure of the family and the word I'm failing on right now, the equilibrium of the family, right?
Absolutely. And that's so much of the grief that's happening that maybe we're not even aware of. So we do a lot of educating on that in our one-to-one time. I mean, that's a change, losses, all this shifting that's happening that I think a lot of people aren't maybe totally aware of or aren't able to totally appreciate the extent of it. So we do a lot of fleshing that out in our one-to-one work. I think that's really important.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you do see needs beyond the individual, how do you decide about referrals and
Absolutely.
what you do there?
So I think a significant part of the grief counseling role within this hospice bereavement benefit is, I'm not practicing as a psychotherapist in this setting. And we do a fair amount of educating, kind of walking with clients around what our scope is and is not. I so often say to my clients, I know grief is not contained, it's not neat, it's not organized, and I'll still be listening for different things that might indicate a provider with an even broader lens might be beneficial. So if perhaps a client comes to me, certainly as a result of a death loss, but there's a significant history, say, of perhaps some clinical depression or clinical anxiety that I know that needs to be tended to first in order to support their coping with grief. I would have that conversation with a client. I would support them in establishing with therapy in the community. And again, what's really nice because I don't bill insurance is we can continue to work together if they're seeing a therapist in the community as well. So we can kind of take that multi-dimensional approach. But I take that part of my role very seriously. I feel I'm not doing a client justice if there are broader mental health needs that also need to be tended to.
I really appreciate you mentioned the multidimensional approach. This feels like a vision we could have more in mental health generally is you're getting this service that's covered, and now we see that there are more intense needs. Let's work on those too, but you still have this service in place.
Absolutely. And another podcast for another day, but just this is what can happen when insurance isn't a barrier or payment's not a barrier. There's just more fluidity in getting folks what they need.
Yes.
Yeah.
What is the role of relationship in the grief work you do?
Yeah. I think it's central, as it is for, I think so many mental health providers and the work they do. Building, because so often outside of my office, so many people are walking around in a world in which grief, there's so much stigma, misconception, grief literacy in a lot of communities is low. So, I feel a lot of my clients are out in the world living with significant loss, significant grief that doesn't feel seen or heard or honored or validated. They're kind of expected to, be business as usual. So it's so important to me that our space and then thus our working relationship feels safe, open. There's no performing that needs to happen, by my client, the way they so often describe feeling like they have to be masked out in the world, performing at their job, performing in their various roles. So that's central to our work. We have to establish that first if we're going to be able to dive in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then what would you say about cultural considerations as those pertain to the relationship?
Absolutely. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. There are no right or wrong expressions of grief. And we need to be really aware and careful as providers and assessors that we're not deeming one expression of grief as healthy or appropriate and another as unhealthy or inappropriate. Different cultures, different backgrounds, different communities express grief differently, whether that's more quiet or subdued for one person, or for another, maybe it is much more outward or vocal or emotional expression of grief. We have to be really careful about not, again, assessing any of that as right or wrong, healthy, unhealthy, but rather being aware that this can look different, again, from person to person, community to community, background to background.
I just have to say, anytime I talk about grief with someone,
Yeah.
I always think of the death of Nelson Mandela and the people in South Africa. My recollection is that they were gathering in like soccer stadiums and dancing and cheering. And I remember hearing someone say, we don't think of it as, I don't remember the exact words, something like, I don't think of it as mourning his death. I think of it as celebrating his life.
Sure.
And I think that's a really just great example of how expressions can be very different. There was no reason to think that they weren't grieving in some way themselves.
Right. Absolutely. But, what a wonderful example. We would never want to then dismiss grief in that instance, to say, oh, well, look, it's celebratory. That must mean nobody's sad. No.
Right.
That's not, that would be dangerous. No, that's not the case at all. It's, that's a beautiful example of both and, grief and gratitude, grief and celebration allowed to be present at one time.
No, and that I think comes back to this whole piece about the relationship
Absolutely.
and its centrality, right? Because there's so much nuance in the way that people are wired for so many things, including grief.
Absolutely.
What would you say you do to assess these cultural differences when you work with grief?
Absolutely.
And this, thinking of something like intersectionality or however you want to
Absolutely.
think about that.
So in my initial session with a client, one of the many questions I'm asking, I oftentimes say, I know that you and I are meeting as a result of this recent death, but can you take me back as far as you can remember to one of the, either the first or one of the earliest losses you experienced in your life? And can you tell me how grief was either talked about or not talked about, which tends to even more often be the case oftentimes with who I'm working with. And I'm listening for, and I want to hear what have their historical experience has been, around loss, also expressions of that loss. And what I just said, I'm particularly interested in hearing is when grief was not talked about, or that was their experience. And I really want to tune into that because I want to know if that's coming into this space. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's one way I'm kind of assessing for that. Is I want to hear from you. What are your past experiences? How has grief historically manifested for you? And I want to gather all that information. I want to hear all about that to inform our work together.
Because when you think of using a family systems approach, a lot of what you're assessing are family rules, and as we know with family systems theory, those rules aren't necessarily, we're not talking about the rules you write up on the fridge for, or whatever they are. It's those embedded ways of relating with each other that just happen, and sometimes that happens with grief, and sometimes it can be. I want to be careful about using the word damaging, but it can be really unhelpful for people if there's sort of this unwritten rule. We don't talk about grandpa's death.
Exactly. And what I find is again, that's very often the case of what I'm hearing from clients. So then the story they have carried and are now telling themselves is, this person died, wasn't, there perhaps was a funeral, but kind of no mention from there. So what I believe to be true was that everyone is just fine. And so now here I am all these years later, and I'm not fine. And now I'm thinking that means there's something wrong, that I'm doing this wrong. I'm grieving wrong. There's something wrong with me. And I find so often that's what's bringing people, into this space. So that's why we have to take a look back. I need to know that we have to unpack that, I think, in order to establish our work moving forward.
Yes. Another story that I'm often reminded of, I was working with a client years ago, and we were into the third session, and she'd been crying 3 to 5 times a week. And it doesn't usually work this simply. I want to say that for our audience right now, but she, all of a sudden, I had that kind of therapy moment where I put something together from the assessment, and I said, wait a minute, when did your brother die? And this was a young lady, so this wasn't like these are people in their 70s or 80s. She was in her 20s. And she said, well, he died 9 months ago. And I just looked straight at her. I said, you're grieving. Right. That's what's happening right now. And in her case, that's all she needed to hear. Now, that's not necessarily going to be the case for everybody, but that's all she needed to hear was somebody validating, saying, you're grieving. Absolutely. It makes sense to me. You're crying.
Absolutely.
And the crying spells started going away pretty quickly after that. Yeah.
It speaks to how much grief wants to just be seen, heard, named.
Yes.
Because again, so often in the outside world, that's not happening.
Yeah, I realize we've kind of already dealt with this theme a bit, but there does seem to be, in United States culture at least, sort of this imperative to move on with life.
Oh my gosh.
And not slow down and just take in what's happened.
Absolutely. And I'm sure someone with, a scope beyond what I carry could explain even more, but I think that's rooted in individualism, in capitalism, in, we've all been disembodied, and a lot of our systems depend on that disembodiment, kind of depend on us to be disconnected from our grief, because so as to keep going, right? And I don't need to get up on that soapbox in this, in our time here, but I just think it's important to say those are a lot of the systems people are up against, and it's this hamster wheel nearly. And I'm just so grateful when I can, a client is willing to just say, time out. Pause. This isn't feeling right, and they come in and take advantage of our program.
No, that is great. And it's, I think to your point, it's an act of resistance to do that.
Yes.
To say, I know everybody wants me to move on. I'm not ready for that right now.
Absolutely. I even feel energy. I get excited for a client. I absolutely. I think it can be a significant shift for a person when they take that time for themselves. Yeah. And I so often say to clients, it's really hard work and it's an investment, in your future self.
Yeah. I think that's a great way of putting it. In just to draw a parallel with emotionally focused couple therapy, I remember a trainer saying, emotion is not, what's the word he used? I don't remember the word he used, but it's like this slow slog through knee-deep mud to get through emotion.
Yeah.
But if you don't go through it, you're not going to get to the other side where you need to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think grief really kind of fits in that realm too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so too.
Let's see. We talked about models or theories that you use. Now, the most common theory in grief that is typically discussed comes from Kübler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief. Will you please describe the benefits and limitations of this theory?
Absolutely, absolutely. So this was really important work done by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, and especially at a time when nobody was talking about any of this: death, dying, grief. The big takeaway, though, that I find a lot of folks don't know, and I didn't know until part of my own study, is that the stages of grief were developed around interviews and research with people who were dying themselves. So the person living with the terminal illness and the months, weeks, days leading up to the end of their life. Most people think the stages of grief were developed and designed for the griever, the bereaved, those living with the loss. And so somewhere down the line that got a bit misconstrued, and then society ran with this idea, and I think I understand why, because it feels very organized, which we tend to prefer, ran with this idea that, okay, well, grief happens in stages, and I will move through them one by one. I will complete that. It'll be all done grieving, and I can move on. And again, I think there's value to draw from that, anger, bargaining, acceptance. We all experience those. They come up, or they can come up, and we can draw on them as, examples, but they are not going to happen in a linear fashion. It's not as if we go through one stage and then we're done with it. Well, maybe that was our morning, and we'll see what comes up this afternoon. We can bounce all around. So, I when I do grief education work in the community, I always feel like this is like a mic drop moment when people realize, oh, I don't have to be, subscribing to this idea that my grief is going to look linear and organized, because inevitably when it's not, it's a huge relief to people, I think, to find out, there isn't this expectation, that somehow I'm failing because my grief is not feeling organized. It's not feeling linear. It's also not feeling complete. And that's also not the goal. I find myself saying that to clients so often. The goal of grief work is not to get over grief or move on. The goal is to really teach our bodies how to hold grief. The goal is to make room for grief and continued experiences. That's the goal of grief work. So I also try to frame that early on in my work with clients. Because if, a client's moving through grief work thinking that even closure or ending is the goal, then we're on two different trajectories, and so I want to get us on the same page. And I find most people find it to be a great relief to find out that it is not their job to get over, this loss. I mean, how could you, and I oftentimes see shoulders come down when we talk about this as something to live with, versus this insurmountable climb, that feels like will never happen, because it won't. That's just not the goal. Does that make sense?
Oh, it very much makes sense. Years ago, I was actually so happy to hear a religious leader say this too. He was actually sharing his own personal story. I believe his child had died at age 4 from choking on a crayon or something. It was a really horrific experience. It happened a number of years ago. And one of the things he said, which I really appreciated, is I don't see myself ever completely being, quote unquote, over this. And because I think, we mentioned capitalism and individualism, which certainly play a role in this. And we even have to be careful about religious faith messages that tell us, oh, you're not having enough faith if you don't just get over this, because That's just not how grief works.
Absolutely. That's something else that comes up so often in grief work is, I think certainly for some people, their faith background, spiritual background, if they carry with them any infrastructure that way, for some people it's supportive. For a lot of people, they find themselves wrestling with that, maybe for the first time ever. And then that's jarring. That's scary. So something, just an example of something that can come up often in grief work and the exploration of grief. But no, this idea that grief and life will coexist is what we're aiming for. And I should mention too, that's the dual process model of grief is what I root myself in when talking about that concept with clients. The dual process model for grief being this concept, an infinity sign or a figure eight is always offered with, I call it life on one side and grief on the other. And we're wired neurologically to be kind of always doing this dance. Whether we're aware of it or not, our brain is always dancing between kind of life, what's right in front of me, what I'm completing, what I'm doing, and then grief work and that recall and that really love for our person with us in the present.
Yeah, so that dual process model you're talking about, is this a fairly new model, or has it been?
No, I don't think so. And I don't have it right in front of me. And I know we had talked a bit about this when we last connected. I want to say early 2000s, this kind of formal concept was articulated. But.
Well, I will say in the world of social sciences, that's pretty early. But
yeah, okay. See, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess when we think about the history of time, that seems like a relatively new concept. Mm-hmm. But I find that visual is really helpful to clients because again, they've been noticing that this kind of floating or dancing, and I think it's very affirming to find out, there indeed is a circuitry that's happening that I don't have to manage. I don't have to do anything. I can just trust that my brain is doing this work. Of doing this,
weaving between grief and life in front of me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, and I wonder too, does this, and I don't know if you could speak more to the spiritual piece of this. Does this weave into some spiritual work that you might do with clients?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly explore faith and spirituality. I found myself saying in my one-to-work sometimes, I'm not a religious leader or provider, so I always want to stay within my scope. But we explore this quite a bit. Again, when I'm gathering that history, from folks about early losses, what rituals occurred around those losses. For many people, the rituals that occurred were rooted in whatever their faith tradition or system was. I come from a background where there's a loss, a week later there's a funeral and a burial. It's relatively contained timeline wise, and then there's some amount of this kind of like move on back to business. For a lot of people, they need to do a bit of unpacking around messages they received from their religious communities of origin. For many, many people, faith, religion, spirituality is a great comfort, for sure, of course. And can be complicated, and they might need to do some unpacking around it. I think how it comes up in my practice most often is there are a lot of folks who feel like their grief is met with what feels a bit like a sugar coating or let me talk you out of your grief because don't worry, your loved one's in a better place. Mm-hmm. Your loved one is, no longer suffering, which again can bring some amount of relief to people, but grief can coexist in that. This is not an either or situation. You don't have to choose relief or grief. that can coexist. So a lot of people are wrestling, maybe for the first time, or certainly in a new way, with, I've historically had this framework that has brought me a lot of comfort, but it is not right now. And maybe even for some people, it's causing some pain because they're receiving messaging from, well-intended people, but that can feel invalidating to their grief. Does that make sense in terms of like how that comes up and how do we unpack that? And yeah.
Absolutely. That's where I think I was coming from with how, there can sometimes be that message, oh, you just don't have enough faith, or like you said, they're in a better place.
Absolutely.
I just want to emphasize something you said, which I think was really beautiful, and that is relief. I don't remember how you said it, but relief and grief can coexist.
Absolutely.
There can be some relief, but it doesn't mean the grief goes away.
Absolutely. That, and I'm so glad when people, again, come into this space and we talk about that, because I find a lot of people are out in the world feeling guilty that they might feel relieved, or think, how is that possible? That's just horrible. How could I be relieved? But again, that's why I'm so glad we can have the chance to unpack that and understand that can all coexist. And you don't need to explain that to anyone. If that doesn't make sense to the outside world, perhaps what a privilege it is that someone hasn't had to wrestle with that before. But I find, again, it's very relieving to people that absolutely that coexists. And it's not your job to decide either or.
No, yeah. And I could, another maybe side of that is, because you mentioned guilt. I wonder how much guilt gets wrapped up in sort of environment shame-based messages.
Absolutely. Because
I would envision there are some people that feel some relief immediately when their loved one dies.
Absolutely.
It could be because they didn't want to see their loved one suffer, but it could also be, I was tired, I was just exhausted, and I don't have to deal with this anymore. And that could bring on some guilt or shame.
Absolutely. Yeah. We could do a whole podcast on guilt and grief and all of that. I find myself so often saying to clients, guilt is grief in disguise. Guilt is grief in disguise. And what I mean by that is I think a lot of us are maybe familiar with the feeling of guilt, like this tightness in our chest or discomfort in our abdomen. Like a lot of us physically kind of know what guilt feels like. And so I think grief can oftentimes manifest physically quite similarly. And so because guilt maybe feels a bit more familiar, or that label feels more familiar, that's what folks are oftentimes labeling their experience of. Well, I must have done something wrong that I feel this way. And so oftentimes what I'll have folks do is a writing exercise in which, first of all, I define guilt as a response to acting outside of your moral values. So in this context, that's how we define guilt. Guilt is a response to acting outside of your moral values, okay? Were you acting outside of your moral values when you were so exhausted from caregiving 24/7 that you got impatient that one time? Was that a moral failing? And most often people will say, well, no. And good. That's how we know actually what we're dealing with here is grief, not guilt. So we first of all need to be using the right label. And then I'll ask them to rewrite that statement. So if on top the statement is, I feel so guilty that I got impatient with my loved one, when I was caregiving, I say, okay, let's write that out. And they do. Then I have them physically cross out that statement. Then I have them physically write a new statement. I feel sad. This is a grief statement. I feel so sad that my loved one slowly lost their abilities and slowly became dependent on me to meet every single need. And I say, while that's still so hard, that grief statement, we can give that movement. We can breathe that out. We can create channels that allow grief to have somewhere to go. Guilt is very sticky, tacky. It's like molasses. So that's why we want to do this work around shifting what you're naming as guilt to grief. Because I really think that's actually what it is. And grief needs movement. It craves movement. So let's shift it to grief, because then we can give it movement and it has somewhere to go.
I love the way you describe that. And that movement seems like a little bit of leaning into one's humanity too,
Yes.
that this doesn't mean I'm a bad person
right.
Of course this was going to happen. And the other thing I hear that, I really hear a touch of narrative therapy in there,
Yes.
where you're having them reauthor some of the
Yes.
things that they're doing, right?
Absolutely. Thank
Yeah.
you for saying that, because certainly I'm drawing on that all the time too. Absolutely. I want to hear this story from your perspective and your lens. But what I'm in particular listening for in your story is, what has society written for you or named for you that I want to empower you to rewrite for yourself? Does that?
Absolutely. That is so resonant with the narrative approach
Yeah.
too, because so much of it is challenging sort of the societal norms
Right.
that impede us from being able to progress, whether that's through grief or something else, in this case, grief.
Right, absolutely. So very often when I close out this exercise with folks, I'll ask them to describe to me how they're feeling physically. And oftentimes they describe like, my shoulders feel a bit down, or I feel like I'm breathing a little bit more easy. And I think, again, that's because grief can move, whereas guilt is very stuck.
Yeah. We might have addressed this already because in our conversation, but one thing I have here is, how does grief change a person's perspective?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah. There's a quote I very often share in work with clients, and I always say, and I'll say it here, I regret that I don't know, who the original source is, because I would want to give that credit. But the quote reads, "I wish grief on no one, but I wish this lens on the world." So it's to say, I wouldn't want anyone to know the pain of loss. But there is a gained perspective that I think if somehow we could, share that, or if somehow the world could take on that lens, but without having to go through the hard part, I think we'd live in a much softer, gentler, more supportive and connected world. So I find myself sharing that a lot. I think the perspective gained from loss is that loss changes us. The perspective gained is that we were all sold a lie, that it's our job to move on, get over it, kind of back to business. I think there's a lot of perspective gained. People describe feeling like, I feel like what matters to me feels different on this side. I find people oftentimes appreciate authenticity or just kind of a realness that maybe they didn't historically. I think a lot of that's also rooted in pre-grief. Oftentimes people have the energy or capacity to be maybe to do things they don't want to do, to kind of put up with things they don't really want to put up with. Like, a lot of people just have the capacity to kind of do that. But after a loss, because grief demands so much of a person's energy and capacity, I think that's why so often I have clients saying to me, I don't have it in me. I don't have it in me to go to the thing that I just really don't want to go to in the first place. Or, the email thread going around the office. I don't have it in me to get riled up about this, or whatever the example is. And I think it's because people have to really reevaluate kind of like their energy budget, their capacity budget, especially in early grief. So we do a lot of talking about that too, how to navigate that. That ends up with, we end up talking about boundaries a lot and navigating boundaries within relationships and systems. Again, I think for a lot of people, they've historically kind of had the energy to not uphold a boundary. Like they've been able to they have the energy or capacity to navigate what comes with that. But now suddenly they do not have the energy or capacity. So we end up talking about how to utilize boundaries in a compassionate and healthy way to protect some amount of your energy and capacity. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that surprises some people, but we get all into that too, in grief work.
Do you have an example in your mind that, and if you don't, that's fine, but.
Well, I oftentimes draw on Nedra Tawwab. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Who's a mental health provider and author. She has written the books Set Boundaries, Find Peace and Drama Free. Both books I recommend often. But I refer to her work a lot when, for example, I'm thinking about, we know families are a system. For many families, they've operated in a certain way for decades before I'm meeting a client. Now there's been this huge shift or change in the system. And my client, doesn't feel they have the bandwidth maybe to uphold a system the way they historically have, either knowingly or unknowingly. So they're needing some support in how to maybe communicate to their family. Maybe they've never felt comfortable communicating to their family before what they need or don't need. And perhaps this is the very first time they're needing or wanting to be more clear with their family system about what they either have capacity for or don't have capacity for. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Because I would envision that this particularly transpires with grief and loss, where you're already got this heavy weight on you, and then someone might come to this realization, I have to set boundaries for my own mental health.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So often I have clients describe it as like, I used to just put up with X, whatever that was, because I just muster up the energy to do it. And I just don't have the energy now or the capacity. I'm oftentimes offering that label. Just don't have the capacity. And again, folks, I think a lot of work in the one-to-one space is empowering folks to be protective of their capacity in a way they maybe never have.
Maybe this is too strong of a statement, but it almost seems like grief can be an avenue for developmental growth in an area where somebody has really struggled to have that growth in the past.
I think so. Yeah. And I would never want to describe it as like, I don't really believe in silver linings.
Yeah.
I would never, so I always say that to clients. It's not to say like this somehow justifies the loss. But I think when we think about coexistence, or we think about that dual process model, I try to frame it as it's a good thing that you're prioritizing your own capacity.
Yeah.
For the first time in your own life. Yeah.
This is something we talked about prior to our podcast, just to change directions a little bit. Mm-hmm. In what ways do you believe all clinical social workers should be versed in grief work?
Yeah. Well, when this conversation came up, I think I provided this example, and I'll say this again. I have had clients before reach out to the hospice bereavement program saying, either I am in therapy or I was in therapy, but that therapist doesn't do grief work. So I'd like to meet with a grief counselor. And I'm very happy to do that. And we do that. But I always just have a little moment to myself because I think maybe as a field, maybe we've decided that grief work means the result of a death. When grief can be the response to a change, an outcome you didn't expect. I think about the term disenfranchised grief, meaning, you or I are experiencing a loss, a non-death loss, and we're grieving, but society can't see it. So somehow that means it's not that bad or a loss. So, I really think that, therapy work isn't it always about I'm needing support around something I feel like I need or I don't have or I'd like to see, or a change I didn't ask for. I think that's all grief. Is that fair?
I think grief can definitely be a big umbrella for the work that therapists do.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's a really good point.
I think everyone's doing amazing work. I don't mean to, judge these therapists I'm referring to by any means, but I even think for us as a field, we need to, empower ourselves a bit to know that we are doing grief work very often, even if it's not grief as a result of a death.
No, in fact, an example that came to my mind when you talked about this is a space I found myself in the past year or so in my private practice is people going through religious deconstruction.
Yeah.
And there can actually be quite a bit of grief in there, depending on...
Absolutely.
Well, I wouldn't even say depending, but because, even if people choose, say, to stay in a community, it's never the same way they've been involved in that community in the past.
Absolutely.
There's changes that come with that. Some people feel like they need to leave their community.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's I think another example of grief that can happen.
Absolutely.
Is there a special place in grief work for self-reflection? And if so, can you describe your experience in this realm?
And remind me, self-reflection for the clinician, for the client?
Self-reflection for the clinician.
Oh,
yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's always needing to occur in our work. I think one of the biggest spaces for that is in making sure I am doing my own grief work, so that I can arrive fully present to a client. Of course, humans working with humans, there's going to be instances of countertransference or things are going to come up. But really important that I'm doing self-reflection to know where my vulnerable points might be, so that I can, prepare in appropriate ways, to meet with a client. Like I'm, happy to share a personal example. I was a teenager when I lost a parent. And so when I do work with teens who are coming to me as a result of, having lost a parent, I'm always taking just even a little extra time kind of preparing for those sessions. Because I want to make sure I'm never, making assumptions about their experience simply because I had a similar one, things like that.
That's a really great example of self-reflection because there's, I can't remember where I was just reading this, but we can over-identify with a client or under-identify,
right.
and we want to try to get as close to the middle as we can.
Absolutely. Right. So that's, I think an example of how I'm utilizing self-reflection. I think self-reflection can happen after a session too. I think self-reflection informs what ways do I need to care for myself in order to keep doing this work. How do I need to tend to my nervous system in order to continue to have the capacity to do this work. So self-reflection informs that, I think. Yeah, I think it's an integral part of the role. Absolutely.
Okay. So role play is a medium that makes abstract concepts come to life in concrete ways. For that reason, we have a little role play prepared, you and I.
Yeah.
It's scripted, which is fine. This is more to kind of just get a sense of what an encounter might look like in grief work.
Yeah.
Are we reading from the same page here? Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. We're just going to move over a little bit. I'm going to move over a little bit. So I am the client, and so I'll just start here.
Yeah.
I decided to reach out to grief counseling because my dad passed away 3 months ago, and I'm just not feeling like myself. I took a whole week off of work after he died. We knew he was declining, and we were expecting his death. It's not like it was a shock or anything. We had the funeral already, too. I thought maybe I was stressed about planning the funeral and expected to feel a sense of relief once that was over. I'm not sleeping well, even though I'm so exhausted. I have so much more time now that I'm not running to and from my dad's house anymore, yet I can't get anything done. I have no motivation, and my work just seems so unimportant. I can't muster up the energy to care about a meeting that certainly could have been an email. I don't know. I feel like there's something wrong with me. Everyone else in my family seems like they are just back to normal and doing just fine.
Yeah. So first of all, I want you to know that I hear what you're sharing so often in my work with clients. I think almost every single client I see, worries that they're having a harder time than they should be, and so often that's why, they've reached out or we've gotten connected. Very early on in grief work, it is important, that we, it makes me curious about your early life experiences. How was grief not talked about or talked about for you? I'm hearing a lot of shoulds in what you just shared. Like, I should be fine. I should be on top of my work. I should be sleeping better. And I oftentimes say to clients, shoulds are a red flag. Okay. That means we just need to slow down and take a pause. And there's probably some historical stuff speaking there that we can explore.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm curious for you about some historical losses. What can you tell me?
Well, the only other death in my family has been my grandparents. I was young, in 2nd or 3rd grade. I remember my dad telling me that my grandma went to heaven and there was a funeral, but I don't remember my dad ever talking about grief or sadness or anything like that. He seemed like he moved on just fine.
Sure. That was your perception, right? Or what you felt you were observing. Yeah. Yeah. This is the case in many, many family systems, that I work with. And I have learned that not coping is a form of coping, as I oftentimes say. Just because someone was not talking about their grief, certainly does not mean they were not grieving. But it would make sense that as a young person, you'd take on that message that, well, everything must just be fine. For many people, they suppress their grief because they think it's their job to move on. Oftentimes, this leads, though, to symptoms of grief manifesting in sideways ways because it's going to find one way or another to get movement. So that's why we want to set up some channels for that. The sleep piece in particular, and we can talk more about this, but oftentimes I dive in with clients talking about the role of the nervous system and, your nervous system was so active when you were taking care of your dad. That's what allowed you to meet needs 24/7. It's what allowed you to hop out of bed on a moment's notice. And all that adrenaline, all that cortisol that your body was producing to meet those needs, that doesn't just shut off, right when your dad has passed away. Your body is working on tapering that down. But right now, and it's so frustrating, that's why there's just sheer exhaustion, but I can't sleep because your body thinks it's being helpful, right? It thinks it's keeping you at the ready to meet those caregiving needs. And we can talk about some ways to encourage the nervous system to settle, to feel safe coming back down to baseline.
Well, that's really helpful because I've been feeling all of that. I've been worried that I might be having some sort of illness myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hear that too so often from clients. Again, grief manifests in physical ways as much as mental, emotional. And so things like, exhaustion we've talked about, but even brain fog, feeling disorganized. I can't find my keys. I can't find my wallet. Short-term memory loss, even gets affected. I know this wasn't the case for your dad, but I have a lot of folks who've seen their loved one through, say, a cognitive decline, like dementia, and they come to grief counseling thinking, oh my God, I'm getting dementia. I think I'm now experiencing this illness. And then that causes so much anxiety and concern. So it's all to say, I want you to know of the various ways that grief can manifest physically. So there's no fault on your part. Your body's not failing you, but rather these are manifestations that we can then talk about how to tend to them. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. That is the end. And I just have to say, this is why I'm such a believer in role play.
Yeah.
This was, I could really sense your experience with this that I think sometimes doesn't come out just in the, the back and forth with
Absolutely.
the podcast.
Yeah.
Because there's so much packed into what you did. A lot of psychoeducation,
Yes.
of course.
Yes.
And especially just to hear somebody hear about their cortisol levels and how they rise, and they don't necessarily fall right away, is, I think, so helpful for understanding this is why I can't sleep. I can't get into this parasympathetic nervous system activity that I need to be able to sleep well.
Right.
And having these comparisons that you've seen with other clients that feel like they're getting ill, and just so a skill that I often talk with my students about is normalizing. Just normalizing that this is very common stuff you're going through.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I think that's a huge relief to people when they've been worried that there's some personal failing on their part.
And of course, too, the family systems piece that you brought into this. What is your experience of an earlier death, and bringing that into this, and sort of recognizing that, you didn't really learn anything about grieving through that because it was all kind of hidden from you, and you had to just sort of go through this, however you went through it as a child with a grandparent.
Right.
So anyway, thank you for that.
Oh gosh, no, thank you.
Appreciate you building up that script for us today. Okay, to end today, I have 2 questions. One of them you've really kind of already given us that we can put in show notes, but it's about resources that you recommend for grief work. You may have added a couple today that I might get from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so do you have anything else that just comes to your mind immediately?
Yeah, I mean, so The Grieving Brain, it's a book title by Mary Frances O'Connor, who's a scientist. So she's not a therapist. She has so much of her work informs my work with clients. I think it's hugely informative, the work she's done around how does grief literally impact our brains neurologically. Again, because it really, I think, speaks to that client who's worried that something's wrong with them, right? It's hugely validating to find out literally there is a neurological process happening that, I think would be helpful to be aware of for folks. So that's a go-to resource. I had mentioned Nedra Tawwab, who, again, doesn't necessarily do grief work, but has done hugely important work in educating individuals and families on boundaries. She's done a lot of reframing of boundaries to me, help me to understand that boundaries are loving, boundaries are kind, because boundaries allow me to operate in a way I want to. I think boundaries carry such a bad rap as if they're mean and cold, So that's a resource I'm referring to very frequently. And then I had mentioned that dual process model of grief as well, which, again, I think that visual is so helpful to people, to understand that circuitry is occurring behind the scenes. Certainly the resource list goes on and on, but sure. I think those come to my mind right away and what I feel I'm referring probably most often
These are great. I just want to amplify what you said about boundaries. They're not meant to be cold. In fact, I kind of wish we would change the term, call boundaries relationship negotiations. That's really what they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's right. This is what I need for our relationship to for me to not feel resentment or guilt or any of those things that will get between us having a good relationship. That's really all boundaries are.
Absolutely. And that comes up so often in grief work. Again, I don't know if that's surprising or not for folks to hear, but that we are almost always talking about that.
Okay. The last thing I would ask you is, what advice do you have for beginning social workers who would consider going into grief work?
Grief is nothing to fix. And that will not be your role as a clinician. Getting comfortable holding space around what can't be fixed, and that can still be hard for me. And I can even notice like a temptation to want to fix something, but that's really not what people are asking for. I find they're not asking for their grief to be fixed. They're asking for their grief to be seen, heard, and held. So I think that comes to mind right away, that, my advice is that, you're not being asked to fix grief, but rather learning how to get comfortable holding that space for folks. And I guess that was hard at first. That was hard. So we go to grad school. I've learned all these, tricks and these terms, and now I want to offer that to you because I want to make you feel better. But with time and experience, I think comes an increased comfort in holding that space for people and understanding that that's really what people are asking for and in need of.
I think it's a great way to end. It just reminds me of, so much about the relationship is that space that we need to give clients to we validate, we normalize, we give them, everything we can to help them in their process, but it's still their process to own.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what clients want ultimately.
Absolutely.
For the most part, even if outwardly they may not project that.
Yeah. And that's why then we'll think about, what are resources in the community, such as grief support groups. How can I support you in connecting with other people doing this work who might have that get it factor? Mm-hmm. So you don't have to feel like you're totally alone in navigating this. So we also do work around kind of building up that support system, so that's I'm not doing my job right if a client's relying on only this space, right? If they feel they need this space to cope well, I'm not doing my job right. I want them to feel like they're creating that network. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And that can continue beyond our time together. That's my goal.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot because this wasn't part of our program, but do you have any particular resources where people can go to for, say, a grief support group?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, by nature of kind of the patient population we serve, a lot of the bereaved I work with, I refer to the West Suburban Coalition for Grief, the Edina Coalition for Grief. There's a Southwest Coalition for Grief here in the Twin Cities. So I'm oftentimes referring to geographies, nearby where they live. There are some online platforms too. I really love the website What's Your Grief. If this sounds possible, they've made grief hip, or maybe learning about, the way they talk about grief just feels really relatable. How about that? And they've just done a phenomenal job making grief a lot more relatable, instead of maybe this stale feeling thing we don't really want to talk about.
Yeah.
And so What's Your Grief has a wide variety of online resources, education materials, workshops groups you can end up getting involved with. So maybe if location's a barrier or travel's a barrier, there are online resources to connect with other people as well.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
Well, Beth, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. I super appreciate it.
You bet. Yeah. As we close today, I want to thank Peter Monahan and all others who have worked with him in the studio to make this podcast possible. Additionally, I express my gratitude to the University of St. Thomas for providing the resources for this show. Finally, a special thank you again to Beth for joining us today. Take care, everyone.